Welcome to tonight's sleep story, a slow, uneasy tale about a man, his empty workshop, and the one unfinished doll he should have never touched again. If you enjoy dark bedtime stories, haunting folklore, and slow-burn horror that doesn't rush the fear, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. I post new sleep stories every week, and each one is crafted to keep you listening deep into the night. Now settle in, lie back, and let the quiet creaks of an old house guide you closer to sleep. As we begin the Dollmaker, a story about memory, about guilt, and about something waiting patiently in the dark for its face to finally be finished. Take a deep breath, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Elias Rowan had spent most of his life in this workshop, though it did not feel like his anymore. The tools still hung in neat rows. The smell of beechwood and linseed oil still clung to the rafters, but the room felt hollow, as if something essential had slipped out of it when he wasn't looking. Outside, late afternoon sagged toward evening. The light coming through the warped window panes bent the garden and the moor into strange shapes. In that fading light, Elias sat hunched at his workbench, shaving thin curls from a block of scrap pine. He wasn't carving anything in particular, just coaxing the knife through the wood for the comfort of familiarity. A small curl of pine fell and rested on the bench. "Daddy, can I have the curly bits?" The voice was so clear that Elias's hand froze mid-motion. He lifted his head, almost expecting to see Lily beside him, standing on her little step-stool, palms cupped to catch the shavings. But of course there was no one there, just the empty stool, just the dust motes floating in the slanted light. The memory withdrew, leaving the workshop colder than before. Elias set down the knife and rubbed the back of his wrist. The ache there had grown sharper over the years. Doctors told him to take it easy, as if he hadn't been coasting through his days for a decade already. Arthritis, one had said cheerfully, as though naming it made it easier to bear. He leaned back on the stool, exhaling through his nose. His gaze drifted toward the far end of the bench, where an object lay half hidden beneath a strip of cloth and a tin of screws. The unfinished doll. The sight of it brought a familiar tightening to his chest. He had started carving it 10 years ago, Lily's 8th birthday present. He remembered sketching it on an envelope, a jointed body doll, painted eyes, little woolen braids, a lopsided smile she would laugh at. He'd carved the basic shape, the round head, the torso, the faint suggestion of arms and legs, still attached to the block. Then Lily's illness had come in like a storm that never stopped raining. The hospital visits, the quiet conversations, the nurses' sympathy-filled glances, the nights when she was too tired to speak but squeezed his fingers, the morning she didn't wake. Elias had returned to the workshop once after the funeral. He'd picked up the doll, its wood warm from the sun, and suddenly the idea of finishing it had felt unbearable, a toy carved for a life that no longer existed. He'd put it down gently, as if it might break, and walked out again. It had stayed on the bench ever since. He looked at it now. The beech had mellowed to a soft honey colour, untouched and unchanged. No cracks, no dust, except what settled on everything in this room. It looked almost patient, as though waiting for him to return to it. "You're not my work anymore," he murmured. The words tasted bitter. He reached for the dustpan and brush. The movement pulled at his shoulder, but he ignored it. He swept the curls of pine into a little pile, tipped them into the bin, and wiped the bench clean with the flat of his hand. Outside, the sky darkened. The workshop grew dim, then dimmer still. Elias checked the windows, both closed and latched, then flicked off the overhead light. The room collapsed into shadow. Only a faint smear of dusk clung to the windowsill. He closed the workshop door nearly all the way, leaving a narrow gap, the way he always had, and walked down the hallway to the kitchen. He ate a simple supper, bread, cheese, a slice of ham. The radio droned on about road closures and a missing dog. He didn't listen. When he washed the plate and mug, he dried them carefully, wiped the counter twice, and turned off the kitchen light. Upstairs, the landing was dark except for the faint glow from his bedroom. Elias passed Lily's room and paused. He always paused. His fingers brushed the doorknob, and, as always, the urge rose to open it. To prove the bed was still made, the books still lined up, the small chair still tucked neatly under the window. But he didn't open it. He hadn't opened it in years. In his room, he undressed slowly, lowering himself onto the mattress with a grunt as his knees protested. He pulled the blankets up to his chest and lay staring at the faint line of street lamp light creeping under the curtains. The nurse at the clinic had taught him a breathing exercise for nights like this. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. He began counting breaths. Somewhere around 50, sleep finally dragged him under. He didn't dream, not that he remembered. The knock brought him back abruptly, the sound landing in his consciousness like a pebble tossed into deep water. Tap. He opened his eyes. The room was dark, his clock blinking 12:41 in green digits. Tap. Not loud, not forceful, but deliberate. The soft, distinct contact of something small and hard meeting wood. Elias held his breath. It wasn't the ash tree outside. The branches scraped with long, dragging sounds, never sharp taps. It wasn't the pipes. Those made dull clunks and distant groans. No, this knock came from inside the house, from downstairs, from the direction of the workshop. He sat upright slowly, heart fluttering in his chest. "It's nothing," he whispered, though he knew he didn't believe it. He swung his legs out of bed. His joints did their usual morning routine, despite it being midnight. Complain, resist, eventually comply. He slipped on his slippers and opened the bedroom door. Cold air met him on the landing. The house felt wrong, too still, too expectant. He walked to the banister and looked down. The hallway was a vertical stretch of blackness. At the end of it, faint light from the small back window traced a thin grey outline around the workshop door. The workshop door was slightly open. He was sure he had left it nearly closed. Tap. The third knock was so soft it seemed uncertain of itself. Elias flinched. He took the stairs carefully, the way he always did now, one hand on the rail. Each step creaked in its familiar tone. At the bottom, he stood still and listened. Silence pressed in around him. The kitchen stood to his left, dark and square. Ahead, the workshop door waited, a blacker slice in the darkness. The smell of the workshop wood dust, oil, something faintly metallic, drifted out through the narrow opening. He stepped forward. His fingers closed around the edge of the door. He pushed it open and reached for the light switch. The overhead bulb flared on with a harsh hum. The workshop lay exposed in bright yellow light. Everything was where it should be. The shelves, the stool, the pegs of tools. The small pile of pine curls he hadn't swept thoroughly enough. No open drawers, no footprints, no disturbance. Except the doll. Elias's breath hitched. It lay on the workbench, closer to the front edge than he remembered. Only an inch or two, but unmistakably nearer, as if it had been placed facing the room. Its round head angled just slightly toward the door. He approached slowly. Up close, it was still wood. Still the same half-formed figure he had abandoned a decade ago. His old gouge marks ran along the torso. The grain was smooth and solid. But he leaned in. A faint line, curved, shallow, seemed to cross the wood where an eye socket would eventually go. He frowned, blinked, adjusted his position. The line vanished, or blended perfectly into the grain. "You're seeing things," he muttered. "Old eyes, that's all." He lifted the doll, holding it in his hands. It felt heavier than he remembered. He placed it firmly in the exact center of the bench, measured with his fingers. Plenty of room to spare. Absolutely no reason it would move on its own. No reason for it to be anywhere else. He checked the windows and the back door, secure. No signs of anyone entering. Nothing disturbed except that one object, a block of wood that had been sitting untouched for 10 years. He turned off the light. The workshop sank back into shadow. For a moment, as the darkness settled in, he thought he saw the faint suggestion of a small face on the bench, a pale outline watching him leave. He blinked. Nothing there. He closed the workshop door fully this time, and, after a moment's hesitation, slid the brass bolt shut. Upstairs, Elias climbed back into bed with a long, slow exhale. His heart thudded in his ribs. The clock glowed 12:57. He listened for another knock. None came. But sleep did not return easily. And when it finally did, it was as heavy and blank as a stone sinking in water. Elias woke late, with sunlight already spreading across the bedroom floor in a pale, unsteady sheet. His first awareness was of his back aching, the way it always did when he'd lain too stiff for too long. His second was the faint taste of metal in his mouth, a sign he'd slept hard, dreamless and wrong. He sat up slowly, fingers gripping the blanket. Something felt off, but he couldn't name it. Only the uneasy residue of the night before remained. The knock, the open workshop door, the doll lying too close to the edge. Pipes, he murmured, rubbing his eyes. It was the pipes. He didn't believe it. Not fully. Downstairs he boiled water for tea and cracked an egg into a pan, letting the hiss and sizzle fill the kitchen. Familiar sounds. Domestic sounds. He leaned on the counter and waited for calm to settle over him. When he glanced down the hallway, the workshop door stood closed. Bolt still latched. He exhaled in relief he didn't want to admit. After finishing his breakfast, he washed the dishes with slow, purposeful motions, as if the methodical work could anchor him. When the plate was dry and stacked away, he wiped the counter twice, another habit he didn't question, and walked slowly toward the workshop. He unbolted the door. A faint draught of linseed and cold wood greeted him, as it always did. He stepped inside and flicked on the light. Then he froze. The doll was closer to the door than he had left it. It lay on the bench again, but not centered where he'd placed it with such careful intent the night before. Now it sat only a handspan from the edge. Its half-carved torso angled toward the doorway, as though it had been placed deliberately to greet him. Elias didn't breathe for several seconds. The workshop was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual hum from the outside lamp seemed absent. He approached with measured steps, as though afraid of startling something alive. "You didn't move," he whispered. His voice cracked. But the doll lay as still as any wood-carving should. Blank, unfinished, the outline of limbs still attached to the block. Its round head remained smooth, mostly, but as he leaned closer, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A groove, thin, barely visible. A shallow crescent cut across the right side of the doll's face, right where an eye socket would eventually form. Elias ran a trembling fingertip across it. The line was real. He jerked his hand back. "No," he whispered. "Absolutely not." He knew his work like he knew the lines of his own palm. He had not carved that. He would never have carved one eye socket without marking the other. His process was precise, symmetrical, almost ritualistic. He stepped back from the bench, suddenly aware of his own breathing. Someone had been in here. Some child from the village? Impossible. The windows were too small, the door bolted. A prankster? For what purpose? To carve one shallow groove in a block of wood and leave? He checked the workshop carefully. The windows latched, the back door bolted, his tools where they always were. But the sawdust told a different story. Yesterday's shavings had been swept mostly into a pile, but this morning a thin, unmistakable trail of disturbed dust stretched from the bench to the door, as if something had been dragged across the floor in the night. He crouched down. The trail wasn't deep enough to be footprints. It looked more like something small had been slid or carried low, grazing the floor. His stomach tightened. He followed the faint track with his eyes. It stopped a few inches before the door, right where the doll now lay waiting. Elias's mouth went dry. He lifted the doll carefully. The wood felt cold, heavier than it should. He held it up to the light, turning it slowly. The grain caught the glow in soft ripples. Only that one new groove interrupted the untouched surface. "You didn't do this," he told himself firmly. "You didn't sleepwalk. You didn't touch it." But a whisper of doubt curled into his thoughts. He had woken tired, heavy. The faint metallic taste still lingered on his tongue, the taste he sometimes got after an episode of restless wandering, of sleepless tossing he didn't remember. He forced the thought away. He wasn't losing himself. He wasn't carving in his sleep. He placed the doll back on the bench. No, not just placed it. He positioned it exactly. Dead center, measured with his palm, pressed it firmly into the wood so it wouldn't shift accidentally. Then he stepped back. Nothing moved. He stood there for a long time, staring at it, waiting for a twitch, a tilt, anything to break the unbearable stillness. But the doll remained still. He exhaled, long and shaky, and finally turned away. He would go out, take a walk, let the cold moor air clear his mind. He grabbed his coat from the hallway and stepped outside. The day was grey, but dry. A thin mist rose from the moor and curled around his boots. The cold bit at his face, but the sting grounded him. Halfway down the lane he crossed paths with Mrs. Kemp, the nearest neighbour, an energetic woman in her 60s who always had something to say. "Morning, Elias," she called, waving with her shopping bag. "You were busy last night." He stopped. "Busy?" She nodded toward his cottage. "Saw your workshop light on around, I don't know, midnight. Didn't expect you to be up so late. You carving again?" For a moment, Elias forgot how to speak. "My workshop light was on?" "That's right." She smiled warmly. "Nice to see you getting back into things." He forced a small, polite chuckle. "Right. Yes, just couldn't sleep." She carried on her way, humming. Elias stood rooted to the spot he had turned the workshop light off. He never left it on. He replayed the night, the knock, going downstairs, checking the doll, placing it in the centre of the bench, then switching off the light. He remembered physically flicking the switch. He remembered the room falling into shadow. Yet Mrs. Kemp had seen the light glowing at midnight. Unless she was mistaken. Unless it hadn't been the workshop light. Unless... He didn't finish the thought. He didn't want to. He walked for nearly an hour, trying to shake the tight, crawling feeling beneath his skin. When he finally returned, he hesitated at the workshop door longer than necessary before opening it. The doll remained in the centre of the bench, exactly where he had left it. Relief washed through him so strongly he sagged against the doorframe. "See?" he whispered. "See? Nothing's wrong." But he noticed something as he scanned the room. His favourite carving knife, a small, thin-bladed tool with a worn wooden handle, was lying on the bench. He hadn't used it yesterday. He hadn't touched it in years. His breath caught. Slowly he approached, picked it up and inspected the blade. The edge was clean, too clean, almost polished. Someone had wiped it. Elias swallowed hard. His hands trembled again. He set the knife down carefully as though it might shatter. His eyes drifted back to the doll. Was it his imagination, or was the groove, its tiny half-formed eye, slightly deeper than before? A sudden chill moved through him, sharp as a slicing wind. Enough. Enough of this. He backed toward the door. "Whatever's going on," he muttered, "it ends tonight." He closed the workshop door, locked it, bolted it. For the first time in years, he slid a heavy chair in front of it too. He returned to the kitchen and made a cup of tea he barely tasted. His hands shook so badly he spilled half of it into the sink. He couldn't deny it now. Something was happening in that workshop. Something involving the doll. And whether it was someone breaking in, or something moving on its own, or his own hands acting without him knowing, he needed to know the truth. Tonight, he decided, he would stay awake. Elias stayed awake until almost 2 in the morning. At first it wasn't difficult. Fear had sharpened him, pulled him taut as a wire. He made tea, paced the hallway, checked the bolts on the workshop door 3 times. By midnight his nerves had settled into a shaky rhythm. By 1 o'clock his eyelids began to droop. By 1:30 his body felt weighed down with sandbags. He sat at the kitchen table, elbows on the surface, chin resting on folded hands. His breath fogged faintly in the cool room. He stared at the workshop door across the hall, the door he'd locked, bolted and barricaded with a chair. Nothing moved. No sound came from behind it. The house was silent except for the occasional tick in the walls. He checked the time again, 1:48 a.m. "Stay awake," he whispered. "Just stay awake." He lasted 9 more minutes. Sleep hit him with the suddenness of a trapdoor opening beneath his feet. One moment he was blinking heavily, the world turning soft around the edges. The next, darkness swallowed him whole. He didn't dream. Or if he did, they vanished the instant he dropped into them. When he jerked awake again, sunlight was streaming into the kitchen and the kettle was cold. Elias shot upright. His neck screamed, his back throbbed, his feet tingled with pins and needles. But none of that mattered. His eyes went straight to the workshop door. The chair he had wedged under the handle was still there, the bolt still in place. He exhaled shakily, until he noticed something else. The doormat in front of the workshop was smeared with sawdust. Not the fine, powdery dust that always drifted around the workshop, but thick lines of it, like something had been dragged through it. A cold prickle crawled along the back of his neck. He stood up too fast, steadying himself against the table. His hands trembled as he slid the chair away from the door. The brass bolt felt colder than it should under his thumb. Elias unlocked the door. The workshop was exactly as he had left it. Almost. The doll was not in the centre of the bench anymore. It sat near the edge again, angled toward the door. He stared at it, throat tightening. He stepped slowly inside, eyes darting over every surface, every shadow. Nothing else appeared disturbed. The tools hung neatly from their pegs. The windows were still latched. The back door remained bolted top and bottom. But the sawdust... He turned toward the floor. The disturbance he'd seen on the doormat continued across the boards. Long, shallow trails in the dust, dragging patterns that started near the bench and led toward the door. He crouched and touched the marks. Not footprints, not paw prints, no pattern of shoes or claws, just the sweeping, uneven disturbance of something low and narrow being pulled or pulling itself across the boards. The trail stopped 3 feet from the door, exactly where the doll now sat. Elias stood so quickly he had to grab the bench to steady himself. His pulse hammered at his temples. No, he told the empty room. No. He stepped toward the bench. The doll lay exactly where it always had after these incidents, close to the edge, angled outward, like it had been set there purposefully. The faint groove on its right side, the almost eye, looked deeper than yesterday. He leaned forward until his breath fogged faintly on the wood. Yes, definitely deeper. The curve cut cleaner, sharper, as though shaped by a practiced hand. As though the wood had been worked recently. By whom? His stomach turned. His favourite carving knife, the small thin-bladed one, lay beside the doll again. He hadn't left it there. He hadn't used it. He picked up the knife and inspected it. Fresh dust clung to the blade. He dropped it quickly as if burned. Someone had carved in here last night. Someone had used his tools. Someone had carved the doll. He backed away from the bench and pressed a shaking hand to his mouth. He needed answers. He forced himself back to the hallway and into the kitchen. His heart thudded wildly as he filled the kettle and set it to boil. He needed steady hands for this next part. A hot drink. A moment to think. As the kettle hissed, he stared at the workshop door. Then a thought hit him so suddenly he nearly spilled the boiling water. The locks. He bolted the door last night. He wedged a chair under it. If he had sleepwalked, if that was the explanation, how had he opened the door from the inside with a chair pushing against the knob? He walked back to the workshop. He checked the door. The knob turned easily now, but last night he had used the chair to brace it from the outside. Unless he felt cold bloom in his chest, unless he had moved the chair himself, in a sleepwalking state. He walked through the memory of last night carefully. He remembered placing the chair. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table. He remembered trying not to fall asleep. Then nothing. He couldn't remember dreaming. He couldn't remember waking. He couldn't remember anything between 1:57 a.m. and sunrise. He returned to the workshop and stood before the doll. He looked at the thin groove carved across its face, at the sawdust trail, at the knife. He whispered the thought he had been resisting since yesterday. Did I do this? The silence felt like an answer. He backed away until he bumped into the wall. His breath came unevenly. He forced himself to swallow. He needed proof. Real proof. Something more reliable than memory. He would set traps. He grabbed his coat and left the cottage, walking quickly toward the village shop. His mind churned the whole way. He bought chalk, flour, a cheap kitchen timer, a roll of twine. The girl behind the counter didn't ask questions, though she gave him a curious look when he added a packet of batteries to the pile. Back home, he set to work. He sprinkled a thin line of flour in front of the workshop door, both inside and out. If he crossed it in the night, there would be footprints. He tied twine around his wrist and attached the other end to the foot of his bed. If he tried to get up, the tug would wake him. He placed a battery-powered kitchen timer on his bedside table and set it to beep every 45 minutes. If he slept too deeply, the noise would jolt him awake. Then, for good measure, he took one final step. He moved the doll. He placed it high on a shelf above the bench, a place it couldn't reach even if it somehow slid across the table, a place he would need a stool to access. He dusted the spot around it with chalk powder. If the doll moved even a fraction, the disturbance would be obvious. He cleaned the workbench, wiped the tools. The room felt too bright and too quiet. Then he stepped outside and looked back at the workshop one last time before closing the door. "This ends tonight," he whispered. Night came early, smothering the cottage in stillness. Elias forced himself to stay alert through the evening. He ate dinner without tasting it. He played the radio low. He checked the workshop door every half hour just to reassure himself. At 11, he sat on the edge of his bed. The twine tied to his wrist felt too tight, but he left it. The kitchen timer blinked faintly in the dark. A thin line of flour lay undisturbed before his bedroom door. He lay down, breathed deeply, waited. The first timer beep woke him before midnight. He rose, checked the flour line, a workshop door. Everything was still. He returned to bed. The second beep woke him again. Still nothing. The third, still nothing. Around the fourth beep, he began slipping deeper. His thoughts tangled together, heavy and slow. The darkness felt thick, warm. The twine at his wrist rubbed gently as he shifted. He blinked. The clock read 3:22 a.m. He had somehow slept through the timer. His throat tightened. He sat up sharply and froze. The twine was slack, loose, untied. His wrist was bare, heart pounding. He swung his legs off the bed and stood. The flour line near the door was smudged, not obliterated, but brushed, as though a foot or a heel had dragged lightly through it. "No," he whispered. He stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, the kitchen lay in stillness. The workshop door stood open, wide open. The bolt unlocked. The chair moved aside. And from inside the workshop came the faintest, softest sound. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of wood being carved. Elias edged forward, breath trembling. He reached the doorway and looked inside. The overhead light was on. Sawdust drifted in the air. Tools lay scattered across the bench. And the doll. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It sat on the bench again, its head tilted slightly. Its face changed. A second groove had formed. The beginning of a cheek, a trace of a nose, the faintest suggestion of Lily's small, delicate chin. Elias staggered backward. He didn't know what terrified him more. That something in the workshop had carved the doll, or that the knife on the bench was still warm. Elias did not step into the workshop. He couldn't. His legs refused to move, rooted to the floorboards in the hallway as he stared at the open doorway. The light inside still hummed. The tools sat scattered across the bench in a messy sprawl. And the doll sat upright as though someone had just placed it there. Its blank head was no longer blank. Two faint grooves marked each side of its face now. Not deep, but deeper than before, cut with purposeful strokes. A suggestion of cheeks, the barest outline of a nose. Nothing detailed, nothing finished, but enough to evoke something human. Enough to evoke someone. His throat tightened painfully. It looked a little like Lily. Not fully. Not even halfway. But there was something about the tilt of the head, the curve of the shallow cheek line, the angle of the faint nose ridge. It was so subtle that if he'd seen it carved by another artist, he might not have noticed. But he knew his daughter's face better than his own. And this was trying to be her. Elias's knees wanted to give out. He forced himself to lean against the wall, bracing one unsteady hand on the cold plaster. "What?" He cleared his throat. "What is happening?" The workshop answered with silence. The sound he had heard upon waking, tap, 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 had stopped. The tools were motionless. The sawdust that draped the air floated down in a slow drift. He looked at the shelf where he had placed the doll last night. Chalk dust still circled the empty spot. No prints, no smudges, no fallen pieces of chalk. But the doll had moved anyway. He swallowed. Careful now. Breathe. Think. He stared again at the twine hanging useless at his bedside door. It lay coiled in a loose pile on the floor, not undone. He didn't remember undoing it. He didn't remember getting out of bed at all. He crouched and picked it up. The knot had been precise, not ripped apart or torn, untied, neatly, methodically. The flour line on the hallway floor was smeared in one broad brush mark, just enough for someone to pass without leaving proper prints. His hands shook. He forced himself to step into the workshop. As he crossed the threshold, the smell of linseed, cold wood, and something faintly metallic enveloped him. The air carried a chill, as though the room had been opened to the outside, yet both windows were shut. His tools were scattered, not in a violent way, but placed down in a pattern that made his stomach twist. The carving chisels lay in a tidy row. His favourite knife, the one that had been warm earlier, lay just beside the doll, its blade glinting under the light. Elias's breath hitched as he approached the bench. He lifted the doll slowly, carefully. It felt heavier than the last time he held it. Or perhaps his hands had weakened. He couldn't tell. The faint new lines on its face caught the light differently. The suggestion of bone structure, the curve of a cheek, a shallow indentation where the bridge of a nose would be. His fingers traced the lines, but he pulled them back quickly. shaken by the certainty that the wood there was slightly warm. He set the doll down and staggered back from the bench. "No," he whispered. "No, this is madness." But madness didn't leave physical sawdust trails. Madness didn't carve wood in perfect lines. Madness didn't leave warm blades on benches. Maybe he was sleepwalking. Maybe he had done this himself, without remembering. Maybe the mind was capable of tricks he didn't fully understand. He rubbed his hands over his face. He needed help. By morning, he had made up his mind. He forced himself out of the house, locked the workshop with real force, and walked the half-mile to Dr. Harwood's surgery. The warm lights in the waiting room felt like a different world compared to the cold dread in his cottage. When his name was called, he stepped inside the doctor's small office, trying to appear less shaken than he felt. "Morning, Elias," Dr. Harwood said with his usual mildness. "What brings you in today?" Elias sat stiffly, fingers twisting his cap. "I think I'm sleepwalking." The doctor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, what makes you think that?" Elias hesitated. How could he possibly explain the truth without sounding delusional? That something was carving wood in his locked workshop. That a doll was slowly forming his daughter's face. That even when he trapped himself, something, maybe himself, was still moving. So he offered a safer version. "I've been waking up, somewhere else," he said carefully. "In the kitchen, in the hallway. I don't remember getting there." Dr. Harwood nodded, listening. "Have you ever sleepwalked before?" "Not that I recall." "Any recent stress?" Elias gave a hollow laugh. "Doctor, I've had 10 years of it." The doctor's expression softened. "Well, sleepwalking can return even after decades," he said, "especially in times of emotional strain or isolation. You've mentioned difficulty sleeping before, haven't you?" Elias nodded. "And you live alone, don't you?" Another nod. Harwood leaned back, thoughtful. "I'd like you to keep a journal. Note when you go to bed, when you wake, anything unusual. Leave notes for yourself in the evening. See what's changed in the morning." Elias almost laughed. A journal would solve nothing. A journal would not stop the carving. A journal would not stop the doll's face from becoming clearer. But he nodded anyway, because what else could he do? The doctor paused. "You might also consider staying with someone for a night or two, just to observe if you leave the bed or act in unusual ways." Elias shook his head quickly. "I don't want to." He swallowed. "I'd rather not impose." Dr. Harwood smiled kindly. "You wouldn't be imposing, but I understand. Just keep that option open." Elias stood to leave, thankful the doctor hadn't pressed harder. "Be patient with yourself," Harwood added. "Grief returns in unexpected ways." Elias left the surgery feeling no better, only more aware of the problem. On his way home, the wind bit at his cheeks. The moor stretched dull and colourless. His cottage, when it came into view, seemed smaller, hunched under the weight of its own roof. He paused at the gate, staring at the workshop window. Something, just for a moment, moved behind the warped pane. A flicker of shadow, gone in a blink. His heart lurched. He approached cautiously and unlocked the back door, pulse thudding sickeningly. He pushed the door open and stepped in. Everything was still. Everything exactly where he left it. Except the doll sat on the stool. Not on the bench. Not high on the shelf. On the stool where Lily used to sit. His body went cold. He approached slowly, as if moving through freezing water. The face had changed again. Barely. Subtly. But changed. The second groove was deeper, shaping the suggestion of a cheekbone. The shallow nose ridge had extended. A faint hollow marked where the curve of a mouth might emerge. He reached out a trembling hand, then froze. On the stool, just beneath where the doll rested, lay a small curled shaving of beechwood, fresh. He bent, lifted it between two fingers, held it up to the light, fresh, light in colour, still smelling faintly of oil and warm wood. His breath caught. Someone had carved it recently. Very recently. He held the shaving as though it might burn him. Then he noticed something else. His own sleeve was dusted with the same fine chalk he had used on the shelf. It smeared faintly along the forearm of his coat. Not much, but enough. His stomach dropped. Had he reached for the doll in the night? Had he climbed the stool? Had he carved while half conscious? Had he been staring at the doll beside him, seeing his daughter forming from wood, as he guided the blade with a tenderness he could no longer control? He dropped the shaving. "No," he whispered. "No, I wouldn't." He backed away until he hit the bench behind him. His knuckles whitened. He needed answers. That evening, Elias set new traps. He tied both wrists to the bed frame with twine, loose enough to keep the blood flowing, but tight enough to pull him awake if he moved. He placed more flour across the hall. He locked the workshop door and placed a second chair under the handle, and this time he pocketed the workshop key and hid it under his pillow. Then, exhausted, he forced himself into bed. The cottage felt too quiet, too expectant. Even the ash tree outside seemed to scratch more deliberately along the roof. "Just let me sleep," he whispered into the dark. He closed his eyes. Hours passed, or he thought they passed. Because when he woke the next time, it was not because of the twine pulling his wrists. It was not because of a noise or a shift in the air. It was because he was in the workshop, standing, in front of the bench, a carving knife in his hand. The doll sitting upright before him, its face forming, its shallow features turning toward him, and the wood beneath his fingers was warm. Elias froze. The cold workshop air pressed around him like a wet cloth, but his skin burned where the carving knife touched it. His right hand hovered inches above the doll's face. No, her face, the faint lines of Lily taking shape beneath the blade. He didn't remember walking here. He didn't remember untying the cords around his wrists. He didn't remember retrieving the hidden key from under his pillow. Yet here he stood, close enough that his breath warmed the top of the doll's wooden head. His nightshirt clung damply to his back. His feet were bare on the cold floorboards. Sawdust dusted his ankles, and the faint tremor running down his arm wasn't fear. It was familiarity, muscle memory, the sensation of being mid-work. "No," Elias whispered. "No, I didn't do this." But his hand, his own traitorous hand, felt steady on the knife. The doll stared back with its shallow, half-formed face. The grooves of its eyes deepened in the light, hollow but unmistakably lily-like. Her round cheeks, her soft jaw, the tiny slope of her nose. He took a step back, stumbling into the stool. The knife clattered from his fingers. "What am I doing?" He gasped, pressing both hands to his face. "What am I doing?" The workshop was silent except for the faint patter of dust settling from his movements. He forced himself to breathe, to test reality. He looked down at his wrists. The skin bore faint red marks. Marks from twine. Untied cleanly. Not torn. Not snapped. Untied. He felt sick. He staggered backward, bracing himself on the bench. He needed to get out. He needed cold air, space, anything but this room that smelled of wood and memory and guilt. But as he turned to leave, something caught the corner of his eye. The mirror. A small one, used for checking angles and symmetry, hung crookedly on the wall opposite the bench. Usually he ignored it. Tonight he looked. His reflection stared back. Pale face, red-rimmed eyes, hair stuck in clumps. Sawdust clung to his chin and the collar of his nightshirt. But it wasn't the dust that made him gasp. It was the streak of dried wood stain, dark, sticky, running along his right cheek. The same stain he used when finishing carvings. The same stain that smeared the doll's face now, accentuating its forming features. No. He wiped at it desperately. The stain came off faintly on his fingers. He looked at the mirror again. Another dark mark. On his neck, on his temple, on his forearm. Not blood, not dirt, wood stain. Smudged by fingers that had been working. His fingers. He stumbled away from the mirror and faced the doll. It sat perfectly still, but no longer seemed unfinished. Its features had grown, subtle but more defined. The faint mouth was now a soft, barely parted line. The cheeks had a delicate curve. The eye grooves had deepened into hollows. It didn't look directly at him. It couldn't. It was still just wood. But something about its posture felt expectant. Waiting. "You're not alive," he said hoarsely. "You're not haunted. You're just wood." The silence deepened. "And I'm just tired," he said. "Sleepwalking. That's all. I moved you. I carved you. I must have." He said it again, but the words didn't feel real. His gaze dropped to the floor. Sawdust. A trail of it. Not large, but noticeable. A faint brushed line stretching from the shelf where the doll had once sat to the bench, to the place where Elias now stood. He followed the trail with his eyes, heart hammering harder with each step. It led to the doll. Then past it, then back again, then toward the stool, then toward the bench once more. Not a straight path, not footprints, not dragging, more like pacing, back and forth, small circular motions, a kind of trance. Elias swallowed. He knelt, examining the sawdust more closely. There, pressed faintly in the dust, were fingerprints. Not full prints, just the tips, as though someone had steadied themselves with trembling hands. His hands. He stared at them, then lifted his own trembling fingers. The size matched. "No," he whispered, voice breaking. "No, no." A sudden sound made him flinch violently. Not a tap, not the soft knocking from nights before. A scrape, very faint. Wood against wood. He stood so abruptly he nearly toppled the stool. The doll had shifted, only slightly. Maybe an inch, maybe less. Its head seemed to have tilted forward, just barely, as though listening. Elias backed away until his spine hit the wall. "You didn't move," he whispered. I just didn't see properly. That's all. It's the shadows." But the room was bright. There were no shadows. He pressed his palms to his temples, fingers digging into his scalp. "Get a hold of yourself," he muttered. "This is grief. This is exhaustion. You need sleep." He took a deep breath, then forced himself to step forward. With trembling hands, he picked up the doll. It was warm, warm like human skin. He dropped it with a choked gasp. It struck the floor and rolled, stirred, landing face up, its hollow eye grooves catching the light like dark pits. Something inside Elias snapped. He lunged for the workshop door, but his hand froze on the knob. Not because he decided to stop, but because he couldn't move. His arm trembled violently. His fingers twitched. He tried to pull away, but the rest of his body seemed disconnected, distant, as though wrapped in thick cloth. What's happening?" he gasped. His right hand moved, slowly, deliberately. He wasn't controlling it. "Stop," he whispered, voice cracking. "Stop, please." His hand ignored him. It drifted past the door, toward the bench, toward the carving knife lying there. "No," Elias choked. "No, no, no!" But the hand closed around the handle of the knife with calm precision. He staggered backward, hitting the wall. His arm remained steady, holding the knife with the same gentle confidence he had used to carve toys for Lily. His left hand clawed at the wall, searching for something, anything to brace against. "Let go," he begged. "Let go." His grip tightened. Tears stung his eyes. "No," he whispered again. I won't do it. I won't." But he had already done it. Night after night, bleary, sleepwalking nights he couldn't remember, his own guilt pulling him through the motions, his own hands carving the face he could no longer touch. The doll hadn't moved on its own, it hadn't carved itself, it hadn't shifted. It was him, always him. Elias stared at the doll on the floor, the face that was becoming Lily, the face he had abandoned, the face he was trying to recreate, piece by piece, night after tormented night. "It's me," he whispered, "it's always been me." And in that moment of clarity, pure, brutal clarity, something inside him broke. His right hand lifted the knife, slowly, gently, the way he had always carved wood. "Stop," he begged weakly. His hand didn't stop. It moved to his cheek. The blade touched skin, cold, sharp. "Please," he whispered, "please don't." But the knife drew a line down his cheek, not deep, a shallow groove, a mirror of the doll's. The pain was immediate and hot. He cried out, but his right hand continued its work, carving another faint line under his eye, matching the doll's half-made features, shaping resemblance. His face was becoming hers, his daughter's. He stumbled backward, but his hand followed, carving with slow, careful precision, as though shaping wood instead of flesh. Blood mixed with sawdust on his cheek. He stared at the doll lying on the floor, at the mirrored lines, at the face he was giving himself. "No," he sobbed. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." His hand lifted the knife again, this time toward his other cheek. More carving, more resemblance, more confession in the only language his guilt understood. His knees buckled. He collapsed beside the doll, the knife slipping from his fingers. His breath came shallow and frantic, hands shaking, his own blood warm on his jaw. The doll lay beside him, its carved face illuminated by the overhead light. It looked almost peaceful. He pressed his forehead to the floor, sobbing. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "Lily? I'm so sorry." His voice faded into a shudder. Dust drifted silently through the air. The doll did not move. It did not need to. The truth had already carved itself into him. Thank you for listening to The Dollmaker. I hope this story carried you gently towards sleep, or left you with a lingering chill long after the final whisper faded. If you enjoyed this experience, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new sleep horror story. Your support helps this channel grow and allows more stories like this to find their way into the night. Feel free to explore the other tales waiting here for you, each crafted to guide you deeper into the quiet hours where the mind wanders and shadows feel just a little more alive. Sleep well, and until next time, good night.